Welcome to this channel, where we dive deep into the most fascinating and transformative moments in history. Today, we're exploring one of the most significant yet often overlooked events in English history, the Peasants Revolt of 1381. What began as a desperate response to social injustice and economic hardship would go on to shape the future of political power, class relations, and the very nature of authority. In this video, we'll examine the causes, the key figures like Wat Tyler, and the far-reaching consequences of this revolt that forever altered the course of England's history. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not only what happened, but why it still matters today. So sit back, relax, and let's uncover the story of the Peasants' Revolt. 14th century England was a society deeply shaped by inequality, rigid hierarchy, and economic exploitation. At the heart of this structure stood the feudal system, a social and economic order in which land ownership determined power, status, and wealth. The vast majority of the population were peasants, serfs, and villeins, who worked the land owned by nobles and the church. In exchange for protection and the right to live on small plots, peasants owed labor services, rent, and obedience. This system left little room for freedom or social mobility, and by the late 1300s, it was under immense strain. One of the most important background factors leading to the Peasants' Revolt was the Black Death, 1348 to 1350. This devastating plague killed nearly 1/3 to 1/2 of England's population. While tragic, the population decline caused a severe labor shortage. Surviving workers found their labor suddenly valuable, and many demanded higher wages and better working conditions. However, the ruling elite responded harshly. The government passed the Statute of Laborers 1351, which froze wages at pre-plague levels and restricted workers from freely choosing employment. This law was widely resented, as it directly contradicted the economic reality peasants experienced. Social frustration deepened as peasants saw landowners ignore market forces while enforcing outdated feudal obligations. Lords continued to demand unpaid labor, fines, and rents, even as the cost of living rose. The church, one of the largest landowners, was also criticized for corruption, wealth accumulation, and moral failure. Many lower-class people believed that religious institutions had abandoned Christ's teachings of equality and compassion. Another critical source of unrest was the growing gap between rich and poor. Nobles lived in luxury, while peasants faced hunger, disease, and insecurity. Justice systems favored landowners, and peasants had little legal protection. Over time, resentment turned into collective anger. By 1381, England had become a society ready to explode as economic oppression, social injustice, and rigid feudal control collided with new expectations born out of crisis. Political instability played a crucial role in transforming social anger into open rebellion. In 1381, England was ruled by Richard II, who was only 14 years old. Because of his youth, real power rested in the hands of royal advisors and regents, many of whom were deeply unpopular. These officials were often perceived as corrupt, greedy, and disconnected from the suffering of ordinary people. Their policies intensified resentment rather than easing it. One of the most explosive political decisions was the repeated imposition of poll taxes. England was engaged in the costly 100 Years' War against France, and the crown desperately needed money. Unlike traditional taxes based on land or income, the poll tax required every adult, regardless of wealth, to pay the same amount. This was deeply unjust. For a poor peasant, the tax represented a significant portion of yearly income, while for nobles it was barely noticeable. By 1381, the government had imposed 3 poll taxes within 4 years. Tax collectors often used brutal methods to enforce payment, humiliating villagers and abusing their authority. Communities saw these agents as symbols of state oppression. In many cases, tax officials conducted invasive inspections, especially targeting women, which outraged local populations and violated social norms. The government's refusal to listen to complaints further inflamed tensions. Peasants sent petitions and appeals, but these were ignored or dismissed. Instead of reform, the ruling class responded with threats and punishment. This confirmed a growing belief among the lower classes that justice could not be achieved through existing institutions. Political authority, which was supposed to protect the people, came to be seen as an enemy. Loyalty to the crown weakened as peasants began to believe that the king's advisors had betrayed both the monarch and the people. This breakdown of trust between rulers and subjects was essential in turning scattered anger into organized resistance. Beyond economic hardship and political oppression, the Peasants' Revolt was fueled by a powerful ideological shift. For centuries, feudal society had been justified by tradition and religion. People were taught that social hierarchy was God's will. Nobles ruled, priests prayed, and peasants labored. However, by the late 14th century, this belief was increasingly questioned. One of the most influential ideas came from radical religious thinkers such as John Ball, a preacher who openly challenged social inequality. His famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" captured a revolutionary idea that all humans were equal in God's eyes. Such ideas spread quickly among the peasantry, especially as dissatisfaction with the church grew. Many believed that clergy had become greedy and morally corrupt, abandoning their spiritual duties. This ideological awakening encouraged peasants to think beyond immediate grievances and imagine a different social order. They began to question why they were bound to land, forced into unpaid labor, and denied freedom while others lived off their work. These questions struck at the heart of feudalism itself. The revolt was no longer just about taxes or wages. It was about dignity, justice, and freedom. As these ideas spread, peasants developed a sense of collective identity. They no longer saw themselves as isolated villagers, but as part of a broader oppressed class. This unity was critical in organizing large-scale resistance. When rebellion finally broke out in 1381, it was driven not only by desperation, but also by a belief that change was morally justified. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt represented one of the earliest mass challenges to feudal ideology in English history. It was a moment when ordinary people dared to confront a system that had defined their lives for generations, laying the groundwork for future social and political transformations. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not erupt suddenly. Rather, it was the result of mounting tensions that finally reached a breaking point. The immediate spark occurred in Essex and Kent, regions already known for strong traditions of independence and resistance. When royal tax collectors arrived to enforce the third poll tax, they encountered open defiance. Villagers refused to pay, challenged officials, and in some cases physically expelled them from their communities. This local resistance quickly escalated into organized rebellion. In Essex, a confrontation between villagers and tax officials turned violent, signaling that fear of authority had begun to dissolve. Similar scenes unfolded in Kent, where resentment toward feudal obligations was particularly intense. Peasants had long suffered under manorial courts that fined them harshly for minor offenses and restricted their movement. The poll tax became the final insult, representing not only economic injustice, but also the complete disregard of peasants' suffering by the ruling elite. What made this rebellion unique was its speed and coordination. News traveled rapidly through villages via word of mouth, markets, and religious gatherings. Peasants shared stories of resistance, inspiring others to act. This sense of shared struggle created momentum. People who had never before challenged authority now found courage in numbers. The revolt ceased to be a series of isolated protests and became a mass movement. Local leaders emerged organically, often men respected within their communities rather than traditional elites. These figures organized marches, collected weapons, and articulated demands. Importantly, the rebels initially framed their actions as loyalty to the king, but opposition to corrupt officials. This distinction allowed them to claim moral legitimacy while justifying their defiance. They believed that the king, if properly informed, would side with justice. Thus, the early phase of the revolt demonstrated how localized grievances, when combined with shared ideology and collective anger, could transform into a nationwide uprising. The foundations of feudal authority were beginning to crack under the pressure of popular resistance. As the rebellion expanded, it became clear that strong leadership was essential to maintain unity and direction. Among the emerging leaders, Wat Tyler rose to prominence as the most influential and charismatic figure. Unlike nobles who inherited authority, Tyler earned respect through action, courage, and his ability to articulate the frustrations of ordinary people. Wat Tyler's leadership marked a turning point in the revolt. He helped transform scattered groups of rebels into a disciplined force with clear objectives. Under his guidance, peasants organized marches toward London, recognizing the capital as the symbolic center of royal authority. This decision was bold and unprecedented. Never before had England's lower classes attempted to directly confront the seat of power. Tyler's leadership style was practical rather than ideological. While radical ideas circulated, his focus remained on achievable goals: the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, freedom of movement, and the removal of corrupt officials. These demands reflected widespread grievances and helped unify diverse groups, including peasants, artisans, and urban workers. The organization of the rebels challenged assumptions about medieval peasants being passive or ignorant. They coordinated supplies, selected spokesmen, and maintained discipline during marches. This level of organization shocked contemporaries and terrified the ruling elite. Chroniclers later attempted to portray the rebels as chaotic mobs, but evidence suggests a remarkable degree of planning and restraint. Wat Tyler's rise symbolized a broader transformation in medieval society. Authority was no longer seen as something reserved for nobles by birth. Instead, leadership emerged from competence and shared experience. This shift directly threatened feudal ideology, which relied on rigid hierarchy. Tyler embodied the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves and demand justice on their own terms. As rebel forces from Kent and Essex advanced toward London, the scale and ambition of the peasants' revolt became unmistakable. Thousands of men and women joined the movement, swelling its ranks and broadening its demands. Along the way, rebels targeted symbols of oppression. Manor houses were destroyed, legal records burned, and prisons opened. These acts were not random violence, but deliberate attempts to erase the legal foundations of feudal control. The destruction of records was especially significant. Manorial documents defined obligations such as labor services, rents, and fines. By burning them, rebels sought to eliminate proof of their subjugation. This was a revolutionary act, challenging the very mechanisms through which feudal power operated. It reflected a deep understanding of how authority was maintained through law and documentation. As they approached London, the rebels' goals evolved. While early demands focused on economic relief, later ones emphasized equality before the law and the end of aristocratic privilege. Some rebels even questioned the necessity of nobility itself. These ideas, though radical, demonstrated how quickly political consciousness could develop during moments of crisis. London's population responded with mixed emotions. Many urban workers sympathized with the rebels, sharing grievances against high taxes and corrupt governance. Others feared chaos and violence. Nevertheless, the rebels entered the city with surprising ease, aided by supporters who opened gates and provided supplies. The March on London represented a direct confrontation between the governed and those who governed. It shattered the illusion that feudal authority was unchallengeable. For a brief moment, the balance of power shifted, and the voices of the oppressed echoed through the heart of the kingdom. This phase of the revolt marked one of the most dramatic episodes of popular resistance in medieval European history. The arrival of the rebels in London in June 1381 marked a dramatic turning point in English history. The capital city, usually protected by walls, guards, and royal authority, suddenly became vulnerable. The ease with which the rebels entered London revealed a shocking truth. Royal power depended heavily on cooperation from the population. City gates were opened not by force alone, but by sympathy from ordinary Londoners who shared grievances against taxation, corruption, and elite privilege. Once inside the city, the rebels moved with surprising purpose. They did not attack indiscriminately. Instead, they targeted specific symbols of oppression. One of the most significant acts was the destruction of the Savoy Palace, the residence of John of Gaunt. The palace symbolized aristocratic wealth, political dominance, and exploitation. Its burning was a powerful message that the rebels rejected the legitimacy of noble excess built on peasant labor. Equally important was the storming of prisons. Rebels released inmates, believing that many were unjustly punished victims of a corrupt legal system. This action demonstrated how deeply the revolt was connected to ideas of justice rather than simple revenge. The legal system, dominated by elites, was viewed as an instrument of class oppression rather than fairness. Royal officials were paralyzed by fear and confusion. Many fled or hid, while others attempted negotiation. The absence of decisive leadership exposed weaknesses at the heart of the medieval state. The rebels' success in occupying London shattered the myth that feudal authority was natural, permanent, or divinely protected. For a brief moment, England's social hierarchy was inverted. Servants judged masters, peasants dictated terms, and authority was forced to listen. This collapse of control was unprecedented and deeply unsettling to the ruling elite, who realized that their power rested on fragile foundations. Faced with a massive rebel presence in London, the young king and his advisors were forced into direct engagement. The rebels demanded not chaos, but reform. Their key demands included the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, free access to markets, and the removal of corrupt officials. These were not unreasonable requests. They reflected long-standing injustices embedded in feudal society. Meetings were arranged between rebel leaders and the crown. During these encounters, the king presented himself as a sympathetic ruler willing to hear the people's concerns. Charters were issued promising freedom from serfdom and protection from punishment. These documents gave rebels hope that justice was finally within reach. However, this apparent generosity was deeply deceptive. The ruling elite viewed negotiation not as reform, but as a strategy to regain control. The promises were made under pressure and without genuine intention to uphold them. Still, many rebels believed in the moral authority of kingship and trusted that the monarch would act honorably once freed from corrupt advisors. This moment highlights a critical contradiction in medieval political culture. Peasants rejected feudal oppression, yet still believed in a just king. Their loyalty to the crown was rooted in centuries of tradition, even as they challenged the social order it upheld. This contradiction weakened the revolt, as rebels hesitated to push beyond reform toward complete systemic transformation. The issuance of charters temporarily reduced tension, but it also divided the rebel movement. Some groups began to disperse, believing their goals achieved. This fragmentation created an opportunity for the ruling elite to regroup. The illusion of royal sympathy proved to be one of the most effective weapons used against the rebels. The revolt reached its decisive turning point during a tense confrontation between rebel leadership and royal officials. During a meeting intended to negotiate final demands, a violent incident occurred that resulted in the death of Wat Tyler. His killing was swift and shocking, immediately altering the balance of power. Wat Tyler's death was not merely the loss of a leader. It was the collapse of the revolt's unity. He had served as the central figure capable of holding together a movement composed of diverse regions and interests. Without his leadership, coordination faltered and morale weakened. The king seized this moment with calculated boldness. Addressing the rebels directly, he promised protection and reform if they dispersed peacefully. Many, stunned by Tyler's death and still clinging to faith in royal justice, accepted these assurances. This decision proved fatal to the movement. Once the rebels withdrew, repression followed. Royal forces hunted down leaders, revoked charters, and restored feudal obligations. Courts punished participants harshly, reasserting elite dominance. The ruling class sought not only to suppress rebellion, but to erase its memory through chroniclers who portrayed the rebels as criminals rather than reformers. Yet, despite its defeat, the revolt permanently changed England. It exposed the vulnerability of feudal authority and demonstrated that common people could organize, articulate demands, and challenge power. The execution of Wat Tyler transformed him into a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. His death marked the end of the revolt, but not the end of its influence. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 failed in the short term, but succeeded in reshaping political consciousness. Feudalism would continue, but it would never again appear unchallenged or unquestionable. After the dispersal of the rebel forces, the English ruling elite moved swiftly to reassert control. The apparent calm that followed the king's promises was deceptive, masking a calculated and ruthless campaign of retaliation. Royal officials, emboldened by the collapse of organized resistance, began traveling across England to punish those involved in the uprising. The goal was not merely justice, but deterrence, an unmistakable message that rebellion would never be tolerated again. Charters of freedom issued during negotiations were formally revoked. Courts declared them invalid, arguing they had been granted under duress. This legal maneuver allowed the ruling class to restore serfdom, labor obligations, and manorial authority without apology. Peasants who had believed in royal justice now faced betrayal, reinforcing the deep mistrust between rulers and the ruled. Executions became a tool of political theater. Rebel leaders and suspected participants were publicly hanged or beheaded. These spectacles were designed to instill fear and reestablish social hierarchy. Local communities were forced to witness punishment, reminding them of their place within the feudal order. Even those only loosely connected to the revolt were sometimes targeted, spreading terror far beyond the original centers of rebellion. Landlords regained confidence and enforced labor services with renewed severity. Manorial courts became harsher, fines increased, and surveillance intensified. The ruling elite sought to compensate for the shock of 1381 by reinforcing control at every level of society. This reaction demonstrated how deeply the revolt had shaken the foundations of feudal authority. Yet repression also revealed weakness. The need for such extreme measures showed that obedience was no longer automatic. Power had to be enforced, not assumed. Though feudal structures were restored, they emerged scarred and less stable than before, haunted by the memory of mass resistance. In the aftermath of the revolt, the crown faced a difficult challenge: how to explain the uprising without admitting systemic failure. The solution was to personalize blame. Rebel leaders were portrayed as criminals, traitors, and agents of chaos rather than representatives of widespread grievance. By framing the revolt as the work of a few dangerous individuals, the ruling elite avoided confronting the social injustices that caused it. Among those targeted was John of Gaunt, whose political influence made him a symbol of aristocratic power. Although he had been absent from London during the uprising, rebels blamed him for heavy taxation and corruption. In response, royal propaganda emphasized loyalty to noble authority and painted attacks on aristocratic property as attacks on order itself. Lower-ranking rebel leaders faced swift punishment. Many were executed without fair trials, while others were imprisoned or stripped of land and rights. The lack of legal due process revealed the hypocrisy of a system that claimed to defend justice while practicing arbitrary violence. Ironically, the revolt's demand for equality before the law was answered with even greater legal inequality. Chroniclers, often monks or royal officials, played a key role in shaping historical memory. Their accounts depicted rebels as ignorant mobs driven by envy and greed. These narratives dominated official history for centuries, obscuring the rational motivations behind the revolt. Only much later would historians reassess these events through the lens of social and economic justice. The politics of blame allowed the ruling class to restore confidence among elites while silencing dissent. However, it failed to erase the ideas that had fueled the uprising. Even as leaders were punished, the memory of collective resistance lingered in villages, passed down through stories and local traditions. Although the Peasants Revolt ended in defeat, its psychological impact was profound and lasting. For the first time in English history, ordinary people had witnessed the ruling elite panic, negotiate, and retreat. This experience permanently altered how peasants viewed authority. Fear had been broken, even if obedience was restored. The revolt exposed contradictions within feudal ideology. If hierarchy was divinely ordained, why did nobles flee? If justice belonged to the crown, why were promises broken? These questions lingered long after the executions ended. While peasants could no longer openly rebel, their understanding of power had changed. Landowners, too, were transformed. Many recognized that excessive exploitation risked future unrest. Though reforms were rarely acknowledged publicly, subtle changes occurred. Labor services gradually declined in some regions, replaced by cash rents. Lords became more cautious in enforcing obligations, aware that resistance was possible. The revolt also influenced later political thought. It demonstrated that social order was not fixed, but negotiated. Even failed rebellion could produce long-term change by shifting expectations and exposing injustice. The idea that common people could demand accountability would resurface in later centuries during movements for parliamentary reform and civil rights. Thus, while the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not overthrow feudalism, it weakened its moral authority. The system survived, but it did so under the shadow of resistance. The memory of collective action, betrayal, and courage became part of England's historical consciousness, shaping the slow evolution toward a more just society. Although the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was crushed militarily, its economic consequences unfolded gradually and quietly over the following decades. One of the most significant long-term outcomes was the steady erosion of serfdom. Before the revolt, the feudal economy depended heavily on unpaid labor services owed by peasants to their lords. After 1381, However, enforcing these obligations became increasingly difficult and risky for landowners. The demographic effects of the Black Death had already altered the balance between labor and land. Even after the revolt's suppression, labor shortages persisted, and peasants understood their economic value more clearly than ever before. Lords who attempted to strictly enforce labor services often faced resistance, desertion, or legal challenges. While open rebellion was rare, passive resistance, such as slow work, refusal to appear in manorial courts, or migration, became common. As a result, many landlords found it more practical to commute labor services into cash payments. This shift from labor rents to money rents represented a major transformation in the medieval economy. It reduced personal dependence between lord and peasant and encouraged a more market-oriented system. Peasants gained greater control over their time and labor, even if they remained legally unfree in name. Importantly, these changes were not granted out of generosity. They were concessions forced by economic reality and the lingering fear of unrest. The memory of 1381 reminded landowners that excessive pressure could provoke collective resistance. Thus, while feudal ideology remained officially intact, its economic foundations were steadily undermined. Over time, the distinction between free tenants and unfree serfs blurred. By the late 15th century, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, earlier than in many parts of Europe. Although historians debate the precise causes, the Peasants' Revolt played a crucial role by accelerating trends already in motion and proving that feudal exploitation had limits. Segment 2: Political Awareness and the Evolution of Popular Protest. The Revolt of 1381 also transformed political consciousness among ordinary people. Even though the rebellion failed to secure immediate reforms, it demonstrated that collective action could force the ruling elite to respond. This realization did not vanish with repression. Instead, it reshaped how grievances were expressed in later generations. After 1381, large-scale uprisings became less common, but more subtle forms of protest emerged. Peasants increasingly used petitions, lawsuits, and negotiations to defend their interests. While the legal system remained biased toward elites, it also became a battleground where ordinary people asserted rights and challenged abuses. This shift from violent revolt to political engagement reflected lessons learned from failure. The ruling class, too, adapted. Kings and councils became more cautious about taxation, aware that excessive financial pressure could provoke unrest. Though inequality persisted, governments paid closer attention to public reaction. The idea that rulers had responsibilities towards subjects, however limited, gained strength. The revolt also influenced later movements. In the 15th and 16th centuries, popular protests continued to reference ideas of justice, fair taxation, and the abuse of power. Although leaders avoided explicitly invoking 1381, the memory of mass resistance shaped collective expectations. The belief that authority could be questioned became part of England's political culture. Importantly, the revolt challenged the notion that political thought belonged only to elites. Peasants articulated complex ideas about law, freedom, and moral responsibility. Their demands were not anarchic, but reformist, grounded in lived experience. This legacy contributed to the gradual development of political participation beyond the nobility. Thus, while the Peasants' Revolt did not create democracy, it marked an early stage in the long process through which ordinary people began to see themselves as political actors rather than passive subjects. The historical importance of the Peasants' Revolt lies not only in what it achieved, but in what it revealed. It exposed the contradictions at the heart of medieval English society, a system that preached order while practicing injustice, that claimed divine authority, yet relied on coercion and fear. By challenging this system, The rebels forced future generations to confront uncomfortable truths about power and inequality. For centuries, official histories portrayed the revolt as a disaster narrowly avoided. Rebels were described as violent and misguided, while repression was justified as necessary for stability. Modern historical analysis, however, offers a different perspective. The revolt is now understood as a rational response to exploitation, shaped by economic pressure, political exclusion, and moral outrage. The moral legacy of 1381 lies in its articulation of universal principles: fairness, dignity, and accountability. The rebels demanded not privilege, but justice. They sought an end to arbitrary power and a society where labor was respected rather than exploited. These ideals would reappear repeatedly in English history, from debates over taxation to struggles for political representation. The revolt also serves as a reminder that progress is rarely linear. Defeat does not erase meaning. Even failed movements can shape institutions, expectations, and values over time. The courage displayed by ordinary men and women in 1381 challenged assumptions about who could make history. In this sense, the Peasants Revolt stands as one of the earliest expressions of social consciousness in England. It did not dismantle feudalism overnight, but weakened its legitimacy and hastened its decline. The voices raised in 1381 continue to echo as part of a broader human struggle for justice and equality. In the years following the Peasants' Revolt, the English ruling elite increasingly relied on law as a mechanism to restore and maintain social order. The trauma of 1381 convinced landowners and royal officials that force alone was insufficient. Instead, they turned to legal institutions to discipline the population, reinforce hierarchy, and prevent future uprisings. Law became not a neutral system of justice, but a deliberate tool of class control. Manorial courts regained prominence after the revolt. These local courts, dominated by lords or their representatives, handled disputes, enforced labor obligations, and punished disobedience. After 1381, penalties became harsher and surveillance more intense. Attendance at courts was strictly enforced, and failure to comply could result in heavy fines or imprisonment. The goal was to reassert authority at the most local level, where resistance had first emerged. Royal courts also played a central role. Special commissions were sent across England to investigate rebellion, identify participants, and impose punishment. These courts often ignored traditional legal protections, relying on confessions extracted under pressure or testimony from hostile witnesses. Justice was less about truth and more about deterrence. At the national level, Parliament of England supported these measures. Parliamentary statutes emphasized obedience, social stability, and the sanctity of hierarchy. Lawmakers framed rebellion as a moral failure rather than a response to injustice. By defining resistance as criminal rather than political, the state sought to delegitimize dissent entirely. Yet this aggressive use of law revealed anxiety. The ruling elite feared not just another revolt, but the spread of rebellious ideas. Legal repression was therefore both defensive and symbolic. It aimed to demonstrate that authority was unbreakable, even though 1381 had proven otherwise. While law controlled behavior, memory shaped meaning. After the revolt, the ruling class made a conscious effort to control how 1381 would be remembered. Official narratives, written by clerics and royal chroniclers, portrayed the uprising as a moment of madness, an irrational eruption of violence by ignorant peasants. These accounts emphasized chaos and destruction while minimizing legitimate grievances. This selective memory served a clear purpose. If rebellion could be framed as senseless disorder, then repression could be justified as necessary protection of society. The moral authority of the ruling elite depended on this interpretation. Acknowledging injustice would risk validating resistance. Education and religion played key roles in shaping memory. Sermons emphasized obedience and warned against pride and rebellion. Biblical stories were interpreted to reinforce hierarchy, teaching that suffering was divinely ordained and that challenging authority was sinful. Through these messages, elites attempted to rebuild ideological obedience alongside legal control. However, memory could not be fully controlled. Among ordinary people, alternative stories circulated quietly. In villages and households, the revolt was remembered not only as defeat, but as courage. Stories of collective action, temporary freedom, and fearless leadership survived through oral tradition. These memories sustained a sense of dignity, even under renewed oppression. The coexistence of official and popular memory created tension within society. Publicly, obedience was restored. Privately, resentment endured. This division limited the effectiveness of repression. Although another nationwide revolt did not occur immediately, the ideas of justice and resistance remained alive beneath the surface. Thus, memory became a battleground. The struggle over how 1381 was remembered reflected a deeper conflict over who had the right to interpret history and whose suffering mattered. In the decades after the revolt, English society entered a period of heightened social discipline. Fear shaped relationships between classes. Lords feared renewed resistance. Peasants feared punishment. This mutual anxiety altered daily life, making feudal order more rigid on the surface, but more fragile underneath. Landowners imposed stricter rules on movement, marriage, and employment. Peasants attempting to leave their villages without permission faced legal consequences. At the same time, economic necessity forced many lords to tolerate quiet noncompliance. This contradiction, strict rules combined with uneven enforcement, exposed the limits of authority. Fear also influenced governance. Officials became more cautious, sometimes avoiding policies that might provoke unrest. Heavy taxation, in particular, was approached more carefully. The memory of poll taxes lingered as a warning. While exploitation continued, it was often disguised as tradition rather than imposed abruptly. For peasants, fear did not eliminate agency. Instead, it encouraged adaptation. Resistance took subtler forms: negotiation, delay, legal challenge, and migration. These strategies allowed ordinary people to protect their interests without openly defying authority. Over time, such behavior contributed to gradual change. The feudal system survived after 1381, but it did so under constant tension. Its stability depended less on belief and more on enforcement. Once faith in its moral legitimacy was damaged, it could never fully recover. The revolt had revealed that hierarchy was not natural, but constructed, and therefore vulnerable. The Peasants' Revolt marked a psychological rupture. Even in silence, society was no longer the same. The balance between obedience and resistance had shifted permanently, setting the stage for further transformation in the centuries to come. One of the most profound, yet often underestimated dimensions of the Peasants' Revolt was its connection to religious belief and moral reasoning. Medieval society was deeply religious, and faith shaped how people understood authority, justice, and social order. For centuries, the church had taught that feudal hierarchy reflected God's will. Kings ruled by divine right, nobles governed by inherited status, and peasants labored as part of a sacred social balance. By the late 14th century, however, this interpretation was increasingly questioned. Many ordinary people struggled to reconcile Christian teachings of humility, compassion, and equality with the visible corruption of church leaders and the suffering of the poor. Priests and bishops often lived comfortably, owned vast lands, and demanded tithes from impoverished communities. This contradiction weakened the church's moral authority and opened space for alternative interpretations of faith. Religious sermons, biblical stories, and informal discussions became vehicles for social critique. Passages emphasizing the equality of souls before God were reinterpreted as arguments against rigid hierarchy. The idea that all humans were created equal challenged the justification for serfdom and inherited privilege. These interpretations did not reject Christianity. Rather, they claimed to restore its true meaning. This moral reasoning gave the revolt ethical legitimacy. Rebels did not see themselves as criminals, but as defenders of divine justice. They believed exploitation violated Christian values and that resistance was not sinful but righteous. This belief strengthened resolve and reduced fear, allowing ordinary people to confront authority with confidence. Importantly, these ideas did not disappear after the revolt's defeat. Although open preaching was suppressed, moral questioning continued quietly. Religion, once a pillar of feudal stability, had become a source of critique. This shift represented a significant ideological break, weakening the spiritual foundations of feudalism even as its institution survived. The spread of dissenting ideas during and after the revolt relied heavily on popular communication. Most peasants were illiterate, but ideas traveled effectively through sermons, songs, and storytelling. Preachers played a crucial role, translating complex moral and social arguments into language ordinary people could understand. These messages were powerful because they connected everyday suffering with universal principles of justice. Among the most influential currents of thought were those associated with Lolity. Though not directly responsible for the revolt, Lollid ideas overlapped with rebel grievances. They criticized church wealth, emphasized personal faith, and questioned the authority of corrupt clergy. Such beliefs encouraged individuals to think independently rather than accept official doctrine unquestioningly. Authorities viewed popular preaching with suspicion. Unregulated sermons threatened control by spreading ideas that could not easily be monitored or suppressed. After 1381, laws were strengthened to restrict preaching without approval. This repression acknowledged the danger of ideas themselves, not just armed rebellion. Despite these efforts, dissent persisted. Radical ideas adapted to new conditions, becoming less confrontational but more enduring. Instead of calling for immediate revolt, they emphasized moral reform, fairness, and accountability. This shift made them harder to eliminate and more influential over time. The spread of dissent demonstrated that power operated not only through force, but through belief. Once people began questioning the moral legitimacy of authority, obedience weakened. Even when behavior was controlled, conviction could not be fully restored. This intellectual resistance represented one of the revolt's most lasting legacies. The Peasants Revolt forced medieval society to confront fundamental questions about justice. Before 1381, justice was closely tied to status. Laws differed depending on class, and punishment was often harsher for the poor. The revolt challenged this system by demanding equality before the law, a radical idea for its time. Although these demands were rejected officially, they influenced legal and political thought indirectly. Over time, arguments about fairness, consent, and obligation gained prominence. The belief that rulers had duties towards subjects, not just rights over them, slowly entered political discourse. Intellectual elites could not entirely ignore the revolt. Chroniclers attempted to dismiss it, but legal reforms and cautious governance suggest that lessons were learned. Authorities recognized that injustice threatened stability. Even limited concessions, such as moderating taxation or commuting labor services, reflected this awareness. The revolt also contributed to a broader redefinition of justice as something that could be debated rather than imposed. Peasants had articulated grievances using reasoned arguments, not mere violence. This challenged assumptions about who could participate in moral and political discussion. In the long term, the intellectual legacy of 1381 extended beyond England. It formed part of a wider European pattern in which ordinary people increasingly questioned inherited authority. While change was slow and uneven, the revolt marked an early moment when ideas of justice began to shift from privilege toward principle. Thus, the Peasants' Revolt was not only a social and economic uprising, but an intellectual event. It revealed that feudalism depended as much on belief as on force. And once belief was shaken, decline became inevitable. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 unfolded during a period when the English monarchy itself was unusually vulnerable. The king was young, inexperienced, and heavily dependent on advisors whose authority lacked popular legitimacy. Medieval political theory emphasized the sacred nature of kingship, but that sanctity relied on the king's ability to protect justice and stability. When governance failed, the moral foundation of obedience weakened. In theory, kingship was divinely sanctioned. Subjects were taught that obedience to the king was obedience to God. However, this belief depended on the perception that the king ruled justly. During the years leading up to 1381, governance was marked by corruption, heavy taxation, and indifference to suffering. As a result, reverence for kingship became conditional rather than absolute. The revolt exposed a critical tension within medieval political culture. Loyalty to the crown coexisted with resistance to its policies. Rebels often claimed they acted for the king rather than against him, blaming corrupt officials for injustice. This distinction allowed them to challenge authority without fully rejecting monarchy. It also revealed how fragile political legitimacy had become. Youth magnified this fragility. A young king symbolized continuity, but also weakness. Advisors exercised power without accountability, and their decisions carried the crown's name. When those decisions caused hardship, anger inevitably extended to the monarchy itself. The revolt thus reflected not just social conflict, but a crisis of political representation. This moment forced England to confront an uncomfortable truth. Authority could no longer rely solely on tradition or divine claim. It had to demonstrate competence and fairness. The events of 1381 permanently altered expectations of kingship, planting the idea that rulers could be judged by their actions rather than accepted unquestioningly. Obedience in medieval society was maintained through a combination of belief, habit, and fear. The Peasants' Revolt disrupted all three. When thousands of ordinary people openly defied authority, the illusion of universal obedience collapsed. This breakdown revealed the limits of royal power, particularly when enforcement mechanisms failed or lacked support. During the revolt, royal commands were ignored, officials were chased away, and legal authority ceased to function in many regions. This was not merely rebellion. It was the temporary suspension of governance. The state's inability to immediately restore order exposed how dependent power was on cooperation from below. Fear shifted sides. Traditionally, peasants feared punishment, but in 1381, nobles and officials feared the people. This reversal had lasting psychological effects. Even after repression restored order, the memory of vulnerability remained. Authority became more cautious, aware that obedience was not automatic. At the same time, The revolt demonstrated that fear alone could not sustain long-term stability. Brutal retaliation restored control, but damaged legitimacy. Excessive punishment risked deepening resentment and encouraging passive resistance. Thus, governance increasingly relied on negotiation and compromise, even if reluctantly. The revolt also highlighted the importance of perception. Royal authority depended not only on force, but on being seen as just. Once that image was damaged, restoring obedience required more than repression. This realization influenced later governance, encouraging rulers to balance authority with restraint. 1381 marked a turning point in the psychology of power. The state learned that obedience had limits, and that crossing them could provoke collective defiance. Beyond immediate consequences, the Peasants' Revolt reshaped how authority was imagined and discussed. Symbols mattered deeply in medieval society, and the events of 1381 transformed their meaning. Castles, courts, and officials no longer represented unquestioned power. They became symbols of potential injustice. The common people confronting authority entered popular consciousness. Even though rebellion was suppressed, the idea that power could be challenged endured. Authority was no longer invisible or abstract. It had been seen to falter, negotiate, and retreat. This symbolic shift influenced political culture for generations. Later protests, even when small, were shaped by the memory of collective action. The revolt provided a reference point for what was possible, even if dangerous. It taught that history was not made only by kings and nobles, but also by ordinary people acting together. For rulers, the symbolic lesson was equally powerful. Authority required performance. Justice had to be visible, not merely claimed. Governance became as much about managing perception as enforcing rules. This awareness contributed to the gradual evolution of political communication and accountability. Thus, the crisis of 1381 was not confined to its year. It lingered as a symbol of rupture, a moment when obedience failed and authority was exposed. Though feudal structures survived, their symbolic dominance did not fully recover. The Peasants' Revolt, therefore, stands as a reminder that power is never absolute. It exists within relationships, expectations, and beliefs. And when those are shaken, even the strongest systems can tremble. After the suppression of the Peasants' Revolt, daily life in rural England did not simply return to its old patterns. While feudal authority was formally restored, relationships between lords and peasants had been permanently altered. The revolt had forced both sides to recognize each other differently. Peasants were no longer seen as entirely passive, and lords could no longer assume unquestioned obedience. In many villages, interactions became more cautious. Lords remained powerful, but they exercised authority with greater awareness of its limits. Excessive demands risked resistance, desertion, or legal challenge. Even when peasants complied outwardly, they did so with a new sense of calculation rather than blind submission. Peasants, for their part, became more assertive in defending customary rights. They challenged fines, negotiated rents, and resisted increases in obligations. Although success varied, the willingness to contest authority itself marked a significant change. The revolt had demonstrated that collective pressure could influence outcomes, even if imperfectly. This shift reshaped class relations at the local level. Authority became more transactional. Lords increasingly relied on incentives rather than coercion to secure labor, offering favorable terms to retain tenants. Over time, this contributed to the gradual commercialization of rural society. Importantly, these changes were uneven. Some regions experienced harsh repression and rigid control, while others saw greater flexibility. Local conditions, economic pressures, and individual personalities all mattered. Nevertheless, across England, the assumption of natural hierarchy had been weakened. Thus, while feudalism survived institutionally, its social fabric was altered. Relationships between classes were no longer defined solely by tradition, but increasingly by negotiation, setting the stage for long-term transformation. One of the most significant consequences of the revolt was the subtle expansion of peasant agency in everyday life. Agency did not always appear as open resistance. More often, it took the form of practical decisions about work, movement, and survival. These choices gradually reshaped society from below. Labor remained central. Despite laws restricting wages and mobility, peasants continued to seek better opportunities. Some moved illegally to towns or distant estates, while others negotiated terms before accepting work. Enforcement was inconsistent, and economic necessity often outweighed legal restrictions. This mobility weakened the personal bonds that feudalism depended upon. When peasants could choose where to work, even imperfectly, dependence on a single lord declined. Over time, this contributed to the erosion of serfdom as a lived reality, even when it persisted legally. Work itself also changed. Cash wages became more common, and peasants increasingly participated in local markets. This monetization of labor and exchange reduced the dominance of customary obligations. Economic relationships became more flexible, if also more uncertain. Women, too, exercised agency. They worked, traded, managed households, and in some cases led resistance. Although legal and social constraints remained severe, the upheaval of the late 14th century expanded the space for negotiation and adaptation within daily life. These developments reveal that social change did not occur only through dramatic events like revolts. It unfolded through countless small decisions made by ordinary people. The legacy of 1381 lay not just in memory, but in these everyday practices that slowly transformed English society. Despite outward stability, post-revolt England remained marked by tension. Fear, resentment, and mistrust shaped interactions between classes. Lords feared renewed unrest. Peasants feared punishment. This mutual anxiety created a fragile equilibrium rather than genuine harmony. The revolt's memory played a key role in sustaining this tension. Even when unspoken, it influenced behavior. Lords moderated demands. Peasants tested boundaries. Neither side fully trusted the other. This atmosphere limited the restoration of traditional authority. At the same time, the revolt became a reference point in popular consciousness. It symbolized both hope and danger. For peasants, it represented proof that collective action was possible. For elites, it served as a warning of what injustice could provoke. This shared awareness shaped expectations on both sides. Conflict did not disappear, it changed form. Instead of open rebellion, disputes moved into courts, negotiations, and economic competition. These quieter struggles were less visible but deeply consequential. They gradually redefined rights, obligations, and power relations. The persistence of conflict also reminds us that historical change is rarely complete or uncontested. The Peasants' Revolt did not resolve inequality, but it altered the terms on which inequality operated. It forced society to adapt, even if reluctantly. Post-1381 England was a society living with the aftermath of shock. Stability returned, but certainty did not. The feudal order continued, but it did so under constant pressure, shaped by the memory of resistance and the slow, determined agency of ordinary people. One of the most important lessons learned by the English state after the Peasants' Revolt concerned taxation. The revolt had made it unmistakably clear that that fiscal policies could not be imposed indefinitely without consent or at least acceptance from the population. The poll tax had failed not merely because it was unpopular, but because it violated deeply held ideas about fairness and proportionality. Before 1381, rulers often assumed that subjects were obligated to finance the state's needs regardless of hardship. The revolt challenged this assumption. It demonstrated that taxation could provoke mass resistance when it was perceived as unjust. As a result, governments became more cautious in how they raised revenue. After the revolt, direct taxes on individuals were used more sparingly. Authorities favored indirect forms of taxation, such as customs duties, which were less visible and less likely to trigger outrage. This shift reflected a growing awareness that the state's power depended on maintaining social stability. The revolt also contributed to a gradual recognition that taxation required justification. While the idea of democratic consent did not yet exist, rulers increasingly framed taxes as necessary for common defense or public good. This rhetorical shift acknowledged that subjects had expectations and limits. Although inequality persisted, fiscal policy became more strategic. The memory of 1381 served as a warning embedded in political culture. It reminded rulers that revenue extraction without regard for social conditions could threaten the state itself. Thus, the revolt played a role in shaping the evolution of governance. It forced the English state to recognize that power was constrained not only by institutions, but by popular tolerance. Beyond taxation, the Peasants Revolt prompted changes in how England was governed. The chaos of 1381 revealed weaknesses in administration, communication, and enforcement. In response, the state gradually improved its capacity to manage local affairs. Officials became more attentive to local conditions. Rather than relying solely on force, they sought information, monitored sentiment, and intervened selectively. This approach reflected an understanding that authority worked best when informed and restrained. Governance also became more professional. Over time, bureaucratic practices improved, records were standardized, and legal procedures became more consistent. While these developments were slow, they were influenced by the recognition that mismanagement could have serious consequences. At the same time, the state learned to balance repression with accommodation. Excessive force risked provoking unrest, while limited concessions could preserve stability. This pragmatic approach shaped later medieval governance. Importantly, these changes did not benefit all equally. Administration still favored elites, and justice remained unequal. However, the refinement of governance reflected lessons drawn from crisis. The state adapted not out of idealism, but necessity. Thus, the revolt indirectly contributed to the evolution of a more sophisticated state apparatus. It revealed that ruling required more than authority. It required management. The revolt left a lasting imprint on political culture, particularly in how people thought about obligation and fairness. Taxation became a symbol of the relationship between ruler and subject. When perceived as fair, it was tolerated. When perceived as exploitative, it provoked anger. This cultural memory influenced later generations. Even when the revolt was not openly discussed, its lessons shaped expectations. People remembered that unjust demands could be resisted, and rulers remembered that overreach carried risk. The idea that subjects had limits, that they were not infinitely exploitable, became embedded in governance. This did not eliminate oppression, but it altered its form. Authority became more cautious, and resistance more strategic. The revolt also contributed to the slow emergence of political dialogue. Complaints, petitions, and negotiations gained importance as alternatives to violence. While power remained unequal, communication became part of governance. In this way, the Peasants Revolt of 1381 influenced the evolution of the English state long after its suppression. It reshaped fiscal policy, administrative practice, and political culture. It demonstrated that even failed revolts could force adaptation. The legacy of 1381 thus extended beyond social relations into the heart of governance itself. It marked a moment when the limits of state power were revealed and quietly acknowledged. At first glance, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 appears to be a clear failure. The rebels were defeated, their leaders executed, and their immediate demands rejected. Serfdom was not abolished by law, and the feudal system continued to dominate English society for generations. For centuries, this outcome led historians and chroniclers to dismiss the revolt as a tragic but ultimately meaningless eruption of violence. However, a deeper historical analysis reveals that such a conclusion is overly simplistic. Success in history cannot be measured only by immediate outcomes. Social movements often fail in the short term, but succeed in reshaping structures, ideas, and expectations over time. When viewed through this broader lens, the Peasants' Revolt emerges not as a failure, but as a transformative moment. The revolt fundamentally altered relationships between rulers and the ruled. It exposed the vulnerability of authority, demonstrated the power of collective action, and forced elites to confront the consequences of exploitation. Even though concessions were withdrawn, they had been offered at all, and that fact alone marked a profound shift. Moreover, the revolt accelerated trends already underway. The decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, and the monetization of the economy all gained momentum in the late 14th and 15th centuries. These developments cannot be attributed solely to the revolt, but the events of 1381 played a crucial role in shaping the conditions under which change occurred. The revolt also transformed political imagination. Ordinary people had articulated demands, negotiated with power, and briefly reshaped society. That experience mattered. It changed how people thought about what was possible. Thus, while the revolt failed as an immediate revolution, it succeeded as a catalyst. It disrupted assumptions, forced adaptation, and left an enduring imprint on English history. Its significance lies not in what it achieved instantly, but in what it made inevitable. The Peasants' Revolt offers a powerful case study in how power operates and how resistance shapes social change. Feudal authority appeared stable and unchallengeable. It relied on compliance from below. When that compliance was withdrawn, even temporarily, the system faltered. Power in medieval England was not monolithic. It was distributed across local, regional, and national levels. The revolt exploited these divisions. Local officials fled, communication broke down, and centralized authority struggled to respond. This fragmentation revealed that power was contingent, not absolute. Resistance, too, was complex. It was not driven solely by desperation, nor was it purely ideological. It emerged from lived experience, economic pressure, legal injustice, and moral outrage. The rebels combined practical demands with ethical claims, giving their movement both material and symbolic force. The state's response demonstrated another dynamic of power, adaptation. Repression restored order, but it did not restore innocence. Rulers learned to govern more cautiously, to balance extraction with stability. In this sense, resistance reshaped power, even in defeat. This interaction between authority and opposition illustrates a broader historical pattern. Social change often emerges from conflict rather than consensus. Even when resistance fails, it forces institutions to adjust. The Peasants' Revolt exemplifies this process. It also challenges assumptions about agency. Medieval peasants were not merely victims of history, they were participants. They acted collectively, articulated grievances, and influenced outcomes. Their resistance mattered. By examining the revolt through the lens of power and resistance, we see history not as a story of inevitable progress or permanent domination, but as a series of struggles that reshape societies over time. More than 6 centuries later, the Peasants' Revolt continues to matter, not only as a historical event, but as a lens through which we understand inequality, justice, and social change. It reminds us that demands for fairness are not modern inventions, but deeply rooted in human history. The revolt highlights the dangers of extreme inequality. When economic systems concentrate wealth and power while denying dignity to the majority, instability follows. This lesson remains relevant across time and context. It also demonstrates the importance of voice. The rebels of 1381 did not merely suffer. They spoke. They articulated grievances, challenged authority, and demanded recognition. Even though they were silenced, their words endured. The revolt further illustrates that justice is contested. What rulers define as order may be experienced as oppression by others. History requires us to examine whose perspectives are preserved and whose are marginalized. Finally, the Peasants' Revolt matters because it expands our understanding of historical actors. It forces us to take ordinary people seriously, not as background figures, but as agents capable of shaping events. In studying 1381, we confront enduring questions. How much inequality can a society sustain? What happens when legitimacy collapses? And how does change occur when power resists reform? The Peasants' Revolt does not provide simple answers, but it offers profound insight. It stands as a testament to human resistance, moral courage, and the slow, uneven struggle for justice. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not occur in isolation. Across medieval Europe, the late 14th century was a period of widespread instability marked by economic crisis, demographic collapse, and social tension. The Black Death had devastated populations, disrupted labor systems, and exposed deep inequalities within feudal societies. As in England, surviving workers across Europe found their labor more valuable, while ruling elites attempted to preserve traditional privileges through legal restriction and coercion. In France, parts of Germany, and the Low Countries, peasants and urban workers also resisted exploitation. Revolts such as the Jacquerie in France, 1358, reflected similar grievances: heavy taxation, noble oppression, and the burden of war. These uprisings shared a common pattern: desperation mixed with moral outrage, but differed in organization, scale, and outcome. What distinguished the English Revolt was its national reach and political focus. Many European uprisings were localized or quickly suppressed without negotiation. In contrast, English rebels marched on the capital, forced direct dialogue with royal authority, and articulated coherent demands for reform. This level of organization and ambition was rare. The English case also benefited from a relatively centralized state, which paradoxically made confrontation possible. By targeting London and royal officials, rebels directly challenged the core of political power. Elsewhere, fragmented authority limited such direct engagement. Thus, while the Peasants' Revolt was part of a broader European pattern of unrest, it stood out for its scale, coordination, and ideological clarity. It represented not just resistance, but a bold attempt to redefine social relations. Several factors contributed to the distinctive character of the English Peasants' Revolt. One was the relatively advanced development of English legal and administrative systems. Peasants were familiar with courts, laws, and charters, and they used this knowledge to frame demands in legal terms. Rather than rejecting law outright, They demanded fair application. Another factor was the role of ideology. English rebels articulated arguments about freedom, equality, and justice with unusual clarity. These ideas were not abstract philosophy. They emerged from lived experience and moral reasoning grounded in religion and custom. The revolt also involved diverse social groups. While primarily a peasant movement, it included artisans, laborers, and townspeople. This cross-class participation strengthened the movement and broadened its vision beyond purely rural concerns. Leadership mattered as well. The presence of charismatic and organized leadership allowed the revolt to maintain coherence over a wide area. Many European uprisings lacked such coordination and collapsed quickly. Finally, the English revolt occurred at a moment of political vulnerability. Youthful kingship, unpopular advisors, and fiscal exhaustion created an opening that rebels exploited. Timing amplified impact. These factors combined to produce an uprising that was not merely reactive but aspirational. The rebels imagined a society governed by fairness rather than birth. And although they failed to achieve it, the attempt itself was historically significant. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 contributed to a broader European understanding of social limits and political risk. Rulers across the continent observed events in England with concern. The idea that common people could organize nationally and confront royal authority challenged assumptions about control. Over time, European elites adopted more cautious approaches to labor control and taxation. While exploitation continued, it was increasingly managed through compromise rather than brute force. In this sense, English experience resonated beyond its borders. The revolt also contributed to a slow transformation in how historians and political thinkers understood medieval society. It revealed that medieval peasants were capable of collective reasoning, moral argument, and political action. This challenged stereotypes of passivity and ignorance. In the long run, the Peasants' Revolt belongs to a wider narrative of European transition, from rigid feudalism toward more flexible social and economic systems. It was not the cause of this transformation, but it was a powerful signal of its necessity. By placing 1381 within a European context, we see its true scale. It was both uniquely English and broadly human, a response to injustice, a demand for dignity, and a reminder that social systems endure only as long as people accept them. One of the most significant yet subtle consequences of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was its impact on culture. Medieval culture had long been dominated by elites, nobles, clergy, and royal officials, who controlled literacy, education, and historical narrative. Ordinary people rarely appeared as subjects of history. They were objects of governance rather than voices within it. The revolt disrupted this imbalance, forcing society to confront the presence and agency of the lower classes. Although peasants remained largely illiterate, their ideas circulated widely through oral culture. Songs, stories, sermons, and conversations preserved the memory of collective action. These forms of expression allowed experiences of injustice and resistance to be shared beyond individual villages. The revolt thus contributed to the development of a shared cultural memory among ordinary people. This revolt, though crushed, left behind a legacy that continues to inspire struggles for rights and freedoms across the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe to this history channel for more incredible stories that shape the world we live in today. Don't forget to like, comment, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next historical exploration. See you next time as we uncover even more fascinating chapters from the past.